The dust was the first thing and the last. It was the color of a dying sun, the texture of ground bone. It coated the tongue, turned sweat to mud, and settled in the hollows of a man's grief until it was part of the grief itself. For Boone Whitlow, the silence and the dust were the same element, a single indivisible sacrament of absence. His voice had been burned out of him, cauterized in the same fire that had taken his daughter, leaving only a scar in his throat where words used to live. Now he spoke the language of the vast, red emptiness, the creak of saddle leather, the sigh of a weary horse, the whisper of wind across a cracked plain. It was a language with no name for love, no word for sorry. His horse, a slate-gray gelding named only Horse, trod with the slow, patient rhythm of a creature that knew its rider was already a ghost. They moved through a world bleached of meaning, a series of sun-scorched tableaus. A bleached cow skull, a skeletal saguaro lifting its arms in supplication, a horizon that shimmered with promises it never kept. Boone rode with his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the unfurling emptiness, not for threats, but from a habit he couldn't break. The world had already done its worst. There was nothing left to fear. There was only the riding. He saw her from a distance, a smudge of darkness against the uniform ochre of the ground. A coyote, maybe, or a discarded bundle of rags. But the shape was wrong. It was curled, a comma, in a long, unread sentence of dirt and rock. Horse slowed without command, its ears twitching. Boone's hand, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 reins, rested on the pommel of his saddle. He did not carry a pistol on his hip anymore. The weight of it felt too much like a question he no longer had an answer for. A rifle was still strapped to his saddle, a tool for survival, not for argument. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the fine red powder. The silence here was different. It was heavier, pressed down by the sheer blue weight of the sky. The only sound was the faint thump-thump of his own heart, a traitorous little drum still beating in the wreckage. He walked toward the shape. It was a child, a girl. Her hair, a tangle of sun-scorched black, was fanned out in the dust like a broken wing. Her skin was the color of the earth she was pressed against, chapped and flaked. A dress, once maybe blue or gray, was now just a rag of indeterminate color, ripped at the shoulder. She was so still, so utterly given over to the landscape that he thought she was already gone. Then her fingers twitched. They were curled around a small object, holding it with the last of her strength. Boone knelt, his knees cracking. The movement was slow, deliberate, the way a man moves when he is afraid of startling a memory. He looked at her face, half buried in the dust. Her lips were cracked and white. Her eyelids were a thin, papery blue, dusted with red. He could see the faint, fluttering pulse in the delicate skin of her throat. A life, guttering like a cheap candle in a gale. He looked at what she was clutching. It was a horse, carved from a dark, smooth wood, worn almost featureless by the constant rub of a small hand. It had no legs, just a smooth, curved base. Its neck was arched, its head proud. A child's idea of a noble steed, a talisman against the end of the world. The sight of it lanced through the scar tissue in Boone's chest, a clean, sharp pain that was almost a relief from the dull, constant ache. His daughter, Lily, had owned such a thing. A clumsy, fat-bellied bird he had carved for her from a piece of scrap pine. She had carried it everywhere. He could still feel the phantom weight of it in his palm. He reached out, his hand hovering over the girl's back. He expected to feel nothing. He had trained himself to feel nothing. But the heat rising from her small frame was a shock, a fever heat that spoke of a desperate losing battle. He looked around. A broken fence post lay nearby, half swallowed by the dirt. Beyond it, the endless, indifferent plain. No wagon tracks, no sign of a camp. Just the girl deposited here by a cruel and silent tide. To leave her was to bury her. To take her was, What? An invitation for the past to come flooding back into the empty house he had built inside himself. His silence was a vow, a penance. He hadn't spoken a word since he had failed to scream his daughter's name in the fire, his throat clogged with smoke and horror. What could he offer this child? A mute guide to the land of the dead? He looked at the carved horse again. The wood was dark, unfamiliar. Not pine, not oak. Something older, denser. The carving was simple, but sure. It was a sacred thing, a last connection to a hand that was now gone. He made the choice without thinking. Thought was a luxury he had long since abandoned. There was only the body and what the body does. His hands, which had roped steers and broken horses and buried his own child, slid gently under the girl's feverish body. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a bundle of hot, brittle bones. As he lifted her, a soft moan escaped her lips, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. It was the first human sound to enter his world in a long time, and it was a sound of pure pain. Her head lolled back, and her eyes fluttered open. They weren't blue or brown, but a black so deep it seemed to drink the harsh sunlight and give nothing back. They were eyes that had seen the bottom of things. They looked at him, through him, without recognition, without fear, without hope. Then they slid closed again. He carried her to his horse. The gelding snorted, sidestepping, its hide twitching at the scent of fever and near death. Boone laid the girl as gently as he could over the front of his saddle, her small body draped across the worn leather. Her hand opened, and the wooden horse fell into the dust. Boone stared at it. For a moment he considered leaving it. A clean break. But he couldn't. It felt like leaving a part of her soul behind. He bent, picked it up, and felt the strange, smooth coolness of the wood. It was heavier than it looked. He tucked it into his saddlebag, the small, hard shape a strange new weight against his hip. He mounted behind her, his arms coming around her small, still form to take the reins. Her heat soaked through his shirt, a burning reminder of the life he now held. He turned horse west. There was no reason for it. East was a memory of flame and ash. North and south were just more of the same emptiness. West was the unknown, a journey into the setting sun. It felt like the only direction for a man holding a dying child. As they moved, the dust rose around them, a swirling red veil. He looked down at the top of her head, at the fine black hair powdered with the earth. He was a silent man, carrying a silent child into a silent land. The silence between them was no longer an absence. It was a presence, a fragile, terrifying thing he now had to carry alongside her. The first days were a blur of sun and fever. He rode until the light began to fail, then made camp in the sparse shelter of a rock outcropping or a dry wash. He had a small stock of jerky and hardtack, and a dwindling supply of water in his canteen. He dribbled water onto a corner of his bandana and pressed it to her cracked lips. Sometimes she swallowed. Sometimes the water just ran down her chin and into the dust. He cleaned her face, the grime coming away in streaks, revealing the delicate high cheekbones and the proud arch of her nose. There was a nobility in her features that seemed at odds with her ragged state. Her people, whoever they were not from the flat, pale stock of the towns he had passed through. Her skin, beneath the dust and sun, held the warm, deep tone of the earth itself. She did not speak. Not a word, not a cry. In them he saw not gratitude, but a kind of solemn acknowledgement. An understanding passed between them in that moment, a treaty signed in the language of shared loss. He had returned a piece of her. She had accepted it. They were, for now, bound. Days later, she sat up. She still leaned against his chest as they rode, but she was no longer limp. She watched the land go by with those dark, serious eyes. She ate the small pieces of jerky he gave her, chewing with a slow, deliberate patience. The water in his canteen ran out. For a day, they had nothing. His own throat was a desert, his tongue thick in his mouth. He watched her for signs of distress, but her face was a calm, unreadable mask. That afternoon, she stirred in his arms and pointed. Her finger was small, but the gesture was absolute. She was pointing south, towards a line of low, barren-looking hills. Boone hesitated. He had been heading west, always west, but he had no map, no destination. He was just moving away from a memory. He looked at her. She was still pointing, her eyes fixed on the hills. He had been a scout once, long ago. He knew how to read the land, how to find water. But these lands were not his. He saw nothing in those hills but baked rock and withered scrub. But the certainty in her small gesture was a force of its own. He trusted the horse beneath him. He trusted the rifle on his saddle. He did not trust people. But this small, silent creature was something else. He turned the horse south. It took them hours to reach the hills. The sun was a hammer. The air was thin and hot. Just as he was beginning to believe he had made a fatal mistake, that he had followed a child's hallucination to their deaths, he saw it. A dark green line, almost invisible against the brown rock, in a crease at the base of a canyon. Cottonwoods. Where there were cottonwoods, there was water. He urged the weary horse forward. They found a seep, a place where water pushed its way up through a crack in the rock, creating a small, muddy pool surrounded by a patch of startlingly green grass. It was barely a trickle, but it was life. He and the horse drank deeply. The girl slid from the saddle and knelt by the pool. She did not drink. Instead, she dipped her fingers in the water and drew a line on her forehead, from her hairline to the bridge of her nose. Then she touched the water to her throat and to her heart. Only then did she cup her hands and drink. The ritual was performed with a reverence that silenced the frantic thirst in Boone's own body. He watched her, and he understood that she was not just drinking water. She was speaking to it, honoring it. She knew this land, or the land knew her. Her silence was not an emptiness. It was a listening. They stayed by the water for 2 days, resting, recovering. The girl grew stronger. She would walk around the small oasis, her bare feet making no sound on the rock. She would touch the leaves of the cottonwoods, her fingers tracing their veins. She would sit for hours, watching the sky, her little wooden horse held loosely in her lap. She never smiled, but the hard, brittle tension in her body seemed to be dissolving, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. One afternoon, she found a plant with small, waxy leaves and a pale, tuberous root. She dug it up with a sharp piece of stone and brought it to Boone. She broke a piece off and ate it, watching him. Then she held the rest out to him. He recognized it, vaguely. A desert root, something the natives knew how to find. He had seen soldiers try to eat them raw and get sick. But she had known which one to pick. He took it and ate. It was starchy, slightly bitter, but it was food. It was a gift. In her, Boone began to see a different kind of strength, a resilience that had nothing to do with the brute force he knew. It was a strength born of knowledge, of belonging to the earth in a way he never could. He was a trespasser here, a ghost haunting a landscape that was not his. She was a part of it, as much as the rock and the water and the hardy, clinging plants. Her ancestors had walked this ground, had known its secrets, had given it names he would never know. And his ancestors, his people, had tried to wipe those names from the face of the earth. He started having dreams again. Not of the fire, not of Lily, but of a time before that. A time when he wore a blue uniform and rode under a different flag. He remembered the smell of burning lodges, the high, thin screaming of women. He remembered the blank faces of the men he rode with, men who believed they were taming a wilderness, carving order out of chaos. He had believed it too, for a time. He had followed orders. He had been good at it. He had helped clear the land, making it safe for families like his own. He had helped create the emptiness that he now inhabited. One night, he woke up with a start, the memory of a raid so vivid he could taste the gun smoke. The girl was sitting up, watching him. In the pale moonlight, her dark eyes were like pools of ink. She didn't look afraid. She looked like she knew, like she could see the ghosts that clung to him, the blood on his silent hands. She reached out her small hand and touched his arm. Her touch was not forgiving. It was not comforting. It was just there, a point of contact between two solitudes, between the haunted and the survivor. He did not pull away. He sat there, in the vast, echoing silence of the plains, and let her small hand rest on him, a weight heavier than any judgment. The journey west had become a journey inward, and she was leading him into the heart of a past he had killed his own voice to forget. They moved on, the girl now an active participant in their journey. She pointed the way not with words, but with a tilt of her head, a touch on his arm. She led him away from barren stretches and towards hidden springs, through canyons that were invisible from the plains. She found food he would have overlooked, grubs in the rotten bark of a dead yucca, sweet berries on thorny bushes he would have avoided. She was teaching him to see the world again, not as a hostile void, but as a place of hidden life, of secret conversations between the wind and the stone. Her silence was a canvas, and on it, Boone began to see the faint outlines of her people. In the way she wove blades of grass together into a complex braid. In the way she would sometimes stop and press her hand to a rock face, as if listening for a heartbeat within the stone. In the patterns, she would scratch in the dirt with a stick while he tended to the horse, intricate geometric designs that seemed to tell a story he couldn't read. He began to suspect that her wooden horse was not just a toy. The patterns carved into its worn surface matched the ones she drew in the dirt. It was a key, a map, a piece of a larger story. The world began to feel less empty and more populated by ghosts. One day they passed a series of shallow, unmarked graves, little more than heaps of stone. The girl slid from the horse and walked to them. She stood before them for a long time, her small body silhouetted against the setting sun. She did not cry. She simply stood, a silent witness. Boone stayed on his horse, a respectful distance away. He knew what these graves were. He had made some of them himself. Not here, not this specific place, but places just like it. The faces of the men he had shot, the women he had seen fall, swam before his eyes. He felt a hot, metallic taste in his mouth, the taste of old shame. When the girl finally returned and let him lift her back onto the saddle, she felt heavier, weighted with the history of the ground they had just crossed. Their journey brought them into a landscape of hoodoos and mesas, a vast stone city carved by wind and water. It was a place of breathtaking beauty and profound danger. The shadows were deep and cold, and the silence was so profound it seemed to have a sound of its own, a low hum that vibrated in Boone's bones. It was here that they encountered other people for the first time. They were two men, prospectors by the look of them, their faces bearded and burned by the sun, their eyes holding a mean, hungry glint. They had a pack mule laden with gear. They appeared suddenly, coming around a bend in the narrow canyon, and for a moment, all four of them, and the animals, were frozen in a tense tableau. Boone's hand instinctively went to the rifle on his saddle. The men's eyes flicked from Boone's hard, silent face to the girl. "Well now, looky here, Jed," the taller one said, his voice a ugly rasp. "A man out walking his pet." His eyes lingered on the girl, a greasy appraisal that made Boone's blood run cold. The other one, Jed, licked his lips. "What's the matter, friend? Cat got your tongue?" He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Where'd you get the little Injun? Don't see many of her kind around here no more. We done cleared them out." Boone said nothing. He stared at them, his face a mask of stone. His silence, which had been a shield for his grief, now became a weapon. It unnerved them. They couldn't read him. They couldn't know what he was thinking, what he was capable of. The girl was still, her face pressed against Boone's chest. He could feel the slight tremor in her body. "We're looking for a place called Red Willow Creek," the tall one said, his tone shifting, becoming more aggressive. "Heard there was color there. You know it?" Boone gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't lie to us, old man," Jed snarled, his hand moving towards the pistol on his hip. "A man like you, traveling with a little savage like that, you ain't just out for a ride." The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Boone knew this moment. He had lived it 100 times before. The world shrank to the space between him and the men, the distance a bullet would have to travel. He could feel the girl's breath, warm and quick against his ribs. He could smell the sour sweat of the men, the dust, the ozone smell of imminent bloodshed. He thought of Lily. He had fought to make the world safe for her, and in doing so, he had become a monster. He had used violence to carve out a space for peace, and the violence had poisoned the peace. Now the violence had followed him into his silent exile. And it was threatening another child. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. Slowly, deliberately, he moved his hand from his rifle. He raised it, palm open, a universal sign of peace. But it was also a distraction. As their eyes followed his hand, his other hand was already moving, his body shifting. He kicked his right foot free from the stirrup and swung his leg over the back of the horse, sliding to the ground on the opposite side from the men, using the horse's body as a shield. He pulled the girl with him, a single fluid motion. He landed on his feet, crouching, pushing her behind him. The movement was so unexpected, so fast, that the men were caught off guard. "What the hell?" the tall one yelled, fumbling for his gun. Boone didn't hesitate. He grabbed the bottom edge of his heavy leather saddle and yanked hard. The saddle, cinched loosely on the patient gelding, slid off, dragging the heavy rifle with it. It crashed to the ground, spooking the horse, which whinnied and bolted, running back the way they had come. The men's attention was split for a fatal second. It was all the time Boone needed. He lunged forward under the neck of the prospector's mule. He wasn't aiming for the men. He was aiming for the ropes that held their gear. He drew the knife he kept sheathed at the small of his back. It was a skinning knife, not a fighting knife, but it was razor sharp. With 2 quick, powerful slashes, he cut the ropes holding the heavy packs on the mule. The load shifted, pans, picks, and sacks of supplies crashing to the ground with a tremendous clatter. The mule, terrified, bucked and kicked, spinning in the narrow canyon, its braying echoing off the rock walls. Jed fired his pistol, but the shot went wild, ricocheting off the canyon wall with a high-pitched scream. The tall man was trying to control the panicked mule, cursing. In the chaos, Boone grabbed the girl's hand and ran. He ran not back the way they came, but forward, deeper into the maze of canyons. He could hear the men shouting behind them, their voices filled with rage and surprise. They ran until their lungs burned. The girl was surprisingly fast, her bare feet finding purchase on the slick rock. She ran with the sure-footed grace of a mountain goat, her small hand clasped tightly in his. He was bigger, stronger, but she seemed to know the way, pulling him through narrow crevices and over rockfalls he would have thought impassable. The sounds of their pursuers grew fainter, swallowed by the labyrinth of stone. Finally, they collapsed in the deep shadow of a massive stone spire. Boone's chest was heaving, his body screaming with a kind of exertion it hadn't known in years. The girl was breathing hard, but her eyes were bright, alive. She had not been a passive victim in the encounter. She had been his silent partner, her knowledge of the terrain their salvation. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He had not killed. He had used the chaos of the world, the panic of an animal, the weight of greed, to create an escape. It was a different kind of violence, a smarter kind, but it was still a part of him. As dusk fell, A cold wind began to blow through the canyons. They had no horse, no blanket, no food, no water. They had only themselves and the clothes on their backs. The girl's wooden horse was gone, left behind in the abandoned saddlebag. He felt a pang of loss for it, for her. It was the last piece of her old life. He looked at her, expecting to see despair. But she was not looking at him. She was looking up, at the rock face above them. She pointed. High up on the canyon wall, almost invisible in the gathering gloom, was a dark opening, a cave. It looked impossibly high, unreachable. But the girl started to climb. She moved with a spider's agility, finding handholds and footholds in the weathered rock that Boone couldn't even see. She climbed, then stopped, looking down at him. She was not inviting him, she was waiting for him. He was not a young man anymore. His body was a road map of old injuries and lingering sorrows. But he looked at the small figure waiting for him above, a silhouette against the last of the light, and he knew he had to follow. He began to climb. The rock was cold and sharp. His muscles screamed in protest. Twice, he almost fell. But he would look up and see her, still and patient, and he would find another hold and pull himself higher. He was not just climbing a rock face. He was climbing out of the grave he had dug for himself. When he finally pulled himself over the ledge and into the mouth of the cave, he was exhausted, bleeding from a dozen small cuts. The girl was there. In the back of the cave, she had found something, a small dry pile of twigs and grass, a pack rat's nest perhaps. Using 2 pieces of flint she had picked up from the cave floor, she was striking a spark. After a few tries, a tiny flame flickered to life, catching on the dry tinder. A small, precious fire in the vast, cold darkness. She had lost her wooden horse, the symbol of her past. But she had created fire, the symbol of the future. Boone huddled near the small blaze, its warmth a miracle. He looked at the girl, her face illuminated by the flickering light. Her expression was serene, ancient. She was not an orphan he had saved. She was a guide, a teacher. She was the descendant of the people he had helped displace, and she was teaching him how to survive in the world they had left behind. She was showing him how to live in the silence, not as a punishment, but as a space where one could finally begin to listen. The firelight danced in her dark, silent eyes, and in their depths, Boone saw not an ending, but a beginning. The cave became their sanctuary. It was deep, a winding passage into the heart of the mesa. The fire, which the girl tended with a miser's care, kept the profound chill at bay. Thirst was their most immediate enemy. The next morning, leaving Boone to nurse his aching muscles, the girl slipped out of the cave at dawn. She returned hours later, her torn dress soaked. She had found another seep, a hidden place of life within the stone maze. She led him to it, and for the next few days, they existed in a primal rhythm, fetching water, gathering what little edible life they could find, and resting in the deep, quiet dark of the cave. During this time, something new grew in the silence between them. He would watch her. He would see her trace patterns on the cave wall with a piece of charcoal from the fire. They were the same intricate, geometric designs from the wooden horse, the same patterns she had drawn in the dust. They were not random doodles. They were a language, a story. He saw shapes that looked like constellations, like riverbeds, like the branching of a tree. He saw figures, stylized and elongated, men and women and animals, all connected by a web of lines. She was recreating her world, her history, on the walls of their temporary home. One day she drew a new shape. It was a horse, but not the proud, arched-neck creature of her carving. This one was skeletal, its ribs showing, its head low, and on its back was a rider, a featureless stick figure, a ghost. Near the horse she drew a shape of a house, and from the house she drew swirling lines, like smoke or flame. Then she drew a small figure, separate from the rest, a tiny stick person, lying on the ground. She looked at Boone, her dark eyes searching his face. She was telling him her story: a sick horse, a burning home, a lone survivor. Boone felt the air leave his lungs. He knelt, his finger tracing the lines of the burning house she had drawn. Then, his hand trembling, he drew something next to it. He was a clumsy artist, his hands made for ropes and triggers, not for charcoal, but he drew a house, his own house, the one he had built with his own hands, and from its windows he drew the same swirling lines of fire. Then he drew a stick figure of a man, himself, standing outside, helpless. And beside the man, he drew a tiny shape, a bird, with a fat belly and clumsy wings, Lily's carved bird. He looked at the girl. His story next to hers: 2 fires, 2 losses, 2 silences. She understood. A tear, the first he had ever seen her shed, traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She reached out and with her small finger, she smudged the line separating his drawing from hers. She connected the 2 fires. She connected the 2 losses. They were no longer separate tragedies. They were one story, written in smoke and ash on a cave wall. In that moment, the last of the walls around Boone's heart crumbled. The grief he had held in, a solid frozen block, began to melt. A shudder racked his body, a dry, silent sob that had been trapped in his throat for years. He did not make a sound, but his whole body wept. The girl watched him, her own tears falling freely now. She did not touch him. She just watched, her presence a profound and absolute form of witness. She had given him the gift of her story, and in doing so, had unlocked his own. They had to move. The prospectors were a persistent threat, and their small oasis would not sustain them forever. The girl's drawings on the cave wall had grown more urgent. She began to draw a map, a series of mesas, a winding river, and then a particular rock formation, a spire that looked like a hand reaching for the sky. She would tap the drawing of the hand, then look at Boone, an unmistakable question in her eyes. It was a destination. Her destination. They left the cave at night, traveling under the cold light of the stars. The girl navigated the labyrinthine canyons with an unerring sense of direction. She was not just remembering a path. She was reading the stars, the shape of the land, the feel of the wind. She was following a map older than any piece of paper. Boone followed her, his trust in her absolute. He was her guardian, her muscle, but she was the guide, the one with the knowledge. Their journey was hard. They were hunted, not just by the prospectors, but by hunger, by the constant threat of exposure. They saw the 2 men sometimes, distant figures moving across the plains, their progress slow and angry. Boone and the girl were faster, quieter, moving like ghosts through the high country the men dared not enter. Boone became a hunter again, but a different kind. He learned from the girl to build snares from yucca fiber to catch lizards and small rodents. He learned which insects were good to eat, which roots were safe. He was shedding the skin of the man he had been, the man who tamed the land with gunpowder and steel, and becoming someone new, someone who listened to the land and took only what was needed. They were growing closer to the place of the stone hand. The landscape was changing, becoming more dramatic, the mesas taller, the canyons deeper. One evening, camped in a high alcove, the girl did something new. She had been humming, a soft, tuneless sound she sometimes made. But this was different. She began to sing. Her voice was small, hesitant at first, a thin, reedy sound. But it grew stronger. It was a song of mourning, a lament. The melody was strange, alien to Boone's ears, full of quarter tones and gliding notes that seemed to mimic the cry of a hawk or the sigh of the wind. The words were in her unknown tongue, the language of the river stones. It was a song of immense sorrow, but also of immense beauty. Boone sat perfectly still, listening. It was the first time a human voice had been used between them for anything other than a guttural sound of pain or effort. It was music. It was story. It was prayer. He closed his eyes and saw not the flames of his past, but the vast, starry sky, the ancient, silent stones, the small, resilient girl who had led him here. The song washed over him, cleaning the dust from his soul. When she finished, the silence that returned was not empty. It was full, resonant, vibrating with the memory of her song. The next day, they saw it. A towering spire of red rock, weathered by eons into the shape of a hand, its fingers reaching for the empty blue sky. The place from her drawings. The girl stopped, her whole body tensed. This was it, the end of her journey. She looked at Boone, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes. They approached, slowly, cautiously. The area around the stone hand was unnaturally quiet. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the wind whistling through the stone fingers. At the base of the spire, hidden in a deep cleft, was an opening. The entrance to a kiva, or a cliff dwelling. The stones around the entrance were blackened with soot, but it was old soot, weathered by time. This was a place of ghosts. The girl hesitated at the entrance. She looked back at Boone, her face pale. He understood. She did not want to go in alone. He nodded. He would go with her. He was part of her story now. He had to see it to the end. He took her hand, and together they stepped out of the sunlight and into the cool, silent darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and old sorrow. As their eyes adjusted, they saw that they were in a large circular chamber. The walls were covered in paintings, the same style as the girl's charcoal drawings, but these were ancient, their colors faded but still visible. They depicted a rich and vibrant world, hunts and harvests, ceremonies and dances, the birth of children and the passing of seasons. It was the history of her people, written on the rock. But on one wall, the story changed. The paintings became chaotic, violent. There were new figures, men with pale faces and hair the color of straw. They carried long guns that spat fire. The stylized figures of her people were shown falling, their homes burning. It was a depiction of a massacre, the end of a world. In the center of the horrific scene, a single artist had painted the face of a man. It was not stylized like the others. It was a portrait, rendered with a chilling accuracy. A man with cold, pale eyes and a cruel slash of a mouth. A man in a blue uniform. Boone stared at the face, and the blood drained from his own. He knew that face. It was the face of his former commanding officer, Major Croft. A man who believed that the only way to win the West was to erase everyone who had come before. A man who had given the orders that Boone had followed. And as he stared, he saw another face, painted just beside Croft's. A younger man, a scout, his features blurred by time and sorrow, but unmistakable. It was his own face. He was here, on the wall of the dead. Part of the story of their destruction. The girl, who had been looking at the other paintings, now saw where he was looking. She saw the face of Major Croft, and she saw the face of the young scout beside him. She looked from the painting to Boone's face, her own face a mask of dawning, horrified recognition. The man who had saved her was one of the men who had destroyed her people. The silence in the kiva was absolute, a crushing weight. The air was thick with the ghosts of the massacred, and they were all pointing at him. He wanted to run, to flee back into the sun, into the empty land where he could be a man with no past. But he couldn't. Her eyes held him. They were not filled with hate. They were filled with a terrible, profound question. Why? And from behind them a voice spoke, a gravelly rasp that echoed the scrape of a boot on stone. Well, well, a ghost and a relic. Come to visit the tomb? Boone spun around. Standing in the entrance, silhouetted against the bright light, was the tall prospector, and beside him was Jed. And behind them, holding a rifle, was a third man, his face a chilling landscape of scars and malevolent certainty. It was Major Croft, older, his hair gray, his uniform gone, but the same cold, pale eyes, the same cruel mouth. The past had not just followed Boone, it had been hunting him. "I heard stories there was a survivor," Croft said, his eyes flicking from the girl to Boone. "A child who escaped the cleansing. I never believed it, but here you are." His gaze settled on Boone. "And you, Whitlow. I thought you were dead. Heard you lost your nerve after that fire took your family. Went mute. But you always were a survivor. Like a cockroach." Jed laughed. That same wet, ugly sound. "We was just after his horse, Major. Didn't know he was leading us to a reunion." Croft stepped into the kiva, his eyes scanning the paintings on the wall. He pointed his rifle at the girl. "Her people made these. They thought their magic would protect them. Their stories on the wall. But stories don't stop bullets." He turned his chilling gaze back to Boone. "You brought her back here. A loose end. I don't like loose ends, Whitlow. I'm a tidy man." Boone stood between Croft and the girl. He had no weapon. He had no voice. He had only his body and the terrible weight of his history. He looked at the girl. Her face was white with terror, but she was looking at him, not at Croft. She was looking at the man from the painting, the man who had helped destroy her world, and the man who had carried her across the desert. In that moment, Boone knew what he had to do. The journey west had not been a flight from his past. It had been a pilgrimage towards a reckoning. He could not undo what he had done. He could not give her back her people, her home, her voice. He could not erase his own face from the wall of the dead, but he could make a final choice. He could pay the price. He did the only thing he could. He broke his silence. It wasn't a word that came out of his throat. It was a sound. A raw, guttural roar, torn from the deepest part of him, from the scar tissue and the grief and the shame. It was the sound of the fire, of the dying horse, of the screaming women, of his own damned soul. It was a sound of pure, animal rage. He charged. He was not aiming for Croft. He was aiming for the unstable pillar of rock that supported the roof of the kiva entrance. He threw his entire body, all his weight, all his despair, against it. The prospectors were startled, their reactions slow. Croft fired his rifle, and the bullet tore through Boone's shoulder, a searing white-hot pain. But Boone didn't stop. He hit the pillar with a sickening crunch of bone and muscle. The ancient stone groaned. "He's bringing it down!" Jed screamed, turning to run. Croft, his face a mask of fury, tried to aim again, but it was too late. With a deep, grinding roar, the rocks above them began to shift. Dust and pebbles rained down. Boone, his shoulder shattered, his body screaming in agony, pushed again, a last desperate act of will. He saw the girl. She was standing frozen, staring at him. He looked at her, and with his last ounce of strength, he tried to form a word. Lily. It was just a breath, a shape his lips made, unheard in the thunderous collapse. But he hoped she saw it. He hoped she understood. He wasn't saving her as an act of redemption. He was saving her because she was a child, and she deserved to live. It was as simple and as absolute as that. Then the world came down, a torrent of rock and ancient earth, sealing the entrance to the kiva in a cloud of choking red dust. Boone was thrown to the ground, the weight of a falling boulder crushing his legs. He saw Croft and the two prospectors scrambling, trying to escape, but the rock slide was too fast, too total. He heard their screams, cut short. And then there was only darkness, the sharp smell of fractured stone, and a silence more profound than any he had ever known. He lay in the dark, his body a geography of pain. He couldn't move. He could hear the slow, steady drip of his own blood pooling in the dust beside him. This was it, then. The end. He had not earned peace. He had not earned forgiveness. He had simply exchanged his life for hers. He had paid the debt. He felt a small touch on his face, a small hand, wiping the dust from his eyes. He managed to open them. The girl was kneeling beside him. In the almost total darkness, he could just make out her silhouette. The cave-in had not been complete. A small crack high up let in a single, thin sliver of light, a tiny star in their tomb. She had survived. She leaned close, her face next to his. She was humming. The same lament she had sung in the high country. A song for the dead. He could feel her breath on his cheek. He tried to speak, to tell her to go, to find the light, to climb out. But no sound came. His body was broken. His name was buried. The illusion of his peace was shattered. He had nothing left to give. The girl stopped humming. She reached into a fold in her ragged dress, and she pulled something out. The wooden horse. She must have grabbed it, in that last, chaotic moment. She pressed it into his hand, the one that wasn't trapped. The smooth, dark wood was cool against his feverish skin. He curled his fingers around it. He looked at her, his vision blurring. Her face, illuminated by that single, impossible sliver of light, seemed to shift. For a moment, she was not the orphan girl. She was Lily, her face full of love and forgiveness. Then she was the orphan girl again, her eyes full of a sorrow as ancient as the rock around them. Then the two faces merged, becoming one. A child, just a child. He closed his eyes. He could feel his life ebbing away, flowing into the thirsty dust. He held the wooden horse, the last sacred thing in a desecrated world. The silence between them was no longer a silence of grief or of secrets. It was the silence of a completed story. A story of fire and dust, of a debt paid in blood and stone. The last thing Boone Whitlow felt was the small, steady weight of a child's hand on his chest, a final, silent benediction as the darkness took him, and the red dust settled over all. The girl stayed with him until the last of his warmth had faded into the cold stone. Then, she took back the wooden horse, stood up, and turned her face towards the single, thin ray of light, a promise of a sky she now had to walk under alone. She began to climb.